I just wanted to share some things I've been thinking about current events, like especially with when it started with the pandemic, showing the different cracks in our society and our social structures. And then now it's come up with more awareness and a shift in the country about racial injustice. And there have been many responses to that. And many people have talked about this being a really opportune time for change to happen. And I think that's true. But I don't want to be idealistic and I don't want to be pessimistic, because I've also read a little bit about the history of what's happened in different time periods. And I think we need to be optimistic, and in order to really have a cause for optimism, we have to create the causes of change. It's just not going to happen. And so if we don't change what we're doing, then we won't have change. I mean, things will kind of change along, but they won't maybe go in the direction that we want. And so somehow, in thinking of this, somehow I came upon this podcast made by the BBC called Rethink. And I haven't listened to many of them, but I've been making my own rethink in my mind for a few weeks. I listened to a couple of them. They're varied. I think I've listened to 3. They were like really, really different. But what they say is that how the world should change after the corona pandemic. Leading thinkers from across the globe give us their route maps to a better tomorrow. And so this is kind of what I've been mulling in my mind, like, yeah, what needs to happen and how is this going to work? And so I just have one small perspective that comes from the Buddhist teachings. And so I think it starts with the individual. And I think that the more we can have an open mind and clarity in our mind and be educated and be able to collaborate and communicate with others, the more chance we'll have for things to go in a positive direction. And what gets in our way a lot of times is we get in our own way. We are sometimes our own worst enemies. And some people might be aware of that and some people not, but we have mental afflictions in our mind that get in the way. So I've been thinking a lot about, like, what does it take to have real dialogue and real effective communication and collaboration. And so one way to help the individual with this is to look at these 2 mental factors that we're taught about in the Buddhist psychology that help us to create less harm. And these are the mental factors of integrity and consideration for others. So I'll just explain those briefly and some verses from Nagarjuna that help us to do this. Integrity is we're refraining from harm because we respect ourselves. We have a kind of self-respect. We have values that we've cultivated and learned and that we actually treasure and things we want to live by. So we have a sense of how we want to move in our lives. And then that's all nice on paper, but the part of it that really matters is when we often don't live up to this. In our own mind, we can see the moments when we're not living up to our own values. But to have clarity about values that have a lot to do with ethical conduct and not harm, we start there and we aspire to that and we work on that. And that's where, at least in Buddhism, our meditative practice can be extremely beneficial. And then and then in that regard, Nagarjuna has a verse where he says, by focusing one's own mind, one gets rid of an absence of integrity. And I have worked with this for a while, and I guess I used to think that focusing one's own mind meant concentrating one's mind. And then I realized, no, he's got a verse about that. By giving with a unified mind or a concentrated mind, one gets rid of agitation. So he's not talking about concentrating the mind, he's talking about focusing the mind. And so then I'm like, well, what are you focusing on? And for me, I think that what we have to focus on is our ethical values. We have to focus on, it's like what mindfulness is about in a way. And so in this regard, and what I'm talking about now, I would say it's a kind of honest self-reflection of when we lose our integrity, when we don't live by our values, and then we clean up our act. So starting with having that kind of basis, then I think it's more easy to work on the other mental factor, which is consideration for others. And this is where we refrain from harm because we have concern about our impact on others. And in this, I think the verse is really insightful, where Nagarjuna says, by becoming aware of another's fine meritorious qualities, one gets rid of an absence of consideration for others. And there are so many verses in Buddhism that talk about this in this way, where you have to see another person's good qualities. Like we have a verse in the 8 verses of thought transformation where it says, with the thought of attaining awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings, which is our goal in Mahayana Buddhism, right? Who are more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel, I will constantly practice holding them dear. So we have to see that beings are precious and hold them dear, right? And the reason they have these in these verses, both Nagarjuna and the writer of that verse, and there's many other verses, is because it's just natural to our psyches that when we see good qualities in something, like it's easier to have equanimity, it's easier to have love. You know, so many positive regard for others, it comes naturally when we can see the qualities, we can, you know, things like that. So I think what I've been thinking about was, what would that look like now? How do we need to think about things now? And the one I've thought about the most is public health. But the one I want to start with is just thinking about just other individuals. We start with the individual. We can see when we're having difficulty with someone, when we're angry, we're really enhancing or even projecting negative qualities that aren't there. And to really have love for someone, we need to respect them. So what does respect mean to you? And what is the underpinnings of respect that you have for another being? And how can you hold beings in regard, in a positive regard? And we have practices here where we see the kindness of others. And, you know, we have a lot of various practices. So we have practices and ways to work with this with the individual. But then what about, like, with our social interactions with groups? Like I was thinking in COVID, like when Nagarjuna says, by becoming aware, that means it's an active process, becoming aware. It's not like it passively shows up. So like we need to become actively aware of the benefit of wearing a face mask. For our own integrity, we don't want to harm others. It's a value we hold. And in consideration for others, we see that, wow, it's working. The places where people were wearing face masks, people are safer, businesses are functioning better, society is getting back to some more level of function. So that's a kind of consideration for others where we see that we don't want to harm others, and we become aware of what the reality of the situation is around face masks. And then in terms of racial inequity, for me, I guess because I worked in sports a lot, I've been and had roommates and friends and everything. I've known people from many different cultures. And in my work, I met people from all over the world and different places. And what I find is that, you know, becoming aware of another's fine meritorious qualities, for me, the easiest way is to get to know people. And even if you don't have the opportunity to know people directly, face to face, right now with the internet, you can hear people's words in their own words. Poets, musicians, writers, scholars, theologians, and preachers, and people from all over the planet. I mean, you can learn about other people in their own voice, and that's a way to become aware of others' good qualities, I think, even if maybe in your own backyard you don't have a lot of diversity. With moving bigger from individuals to groups to like institutions, in public health, I think we really need to become aware of the benefit of public health. Right now, the chronic underfunding of public health, and these are quotes from the New York Times Magazine, chronic underfunding of public health has put America on track for the worst coronavirus response in the developed world. And why is that? is because we don't have a appreciation for public health, I don't think, and the difficulty it is to pull it off and what it takes. It takes governmental and societal buy-in to it, because you're going to have to do things you don't want to do sometimes as a group, right? And it's if you look at the history of it, there have been political, when you can get the politics and the people and the leaders all on the side of what is known scientifically about this, that's been the best results. And here's what I think it'd be helpful to know about this. In the past century, and this again is a quote from the New York Times Magazine, the largest gains in human health and life expectancy have come from public health interventions, not medical ones. Clinical medicine, treating individual patients with medicines and procedures, has had enormous gains. Hepatitis C is now curable, and so are many childhood cancers, and cutting-edge gene therapies are curing rare genetic disorders, and new technology is making surgeries of every kind safer. But even stacked against those triumphs, public health, the policies and programs that prevent entire communities from getting sick in the first place, is still the clear winner. It has saved most lives by far for the least amount of money, is what was said by the CDC former director. And you'd never guess that based on how little we invest in it. And so if you look at the past history of pandemics, sometimes a quarter of the population of the earth has died. You know? So, I mean, it's like a bang for the buck thing, but it has to be, people have to be bought in. So I think in this area, we have to become aware. And then moving out in a larger way beyond just humans, we could think about the other species on this earth and the earth itself. And here, you know, humans have a huge impact on the physical environment. And so overpopulation, pollution, burning fossil fuels, deforestations, these are the changes that have triggered climate change, the soil erosion, the poor air quality, and undrinkable water. So we have to become aware of this and then find ways in our own lives that we can make impacts. It will be small and it will be large, but in terms of a society, we have to be educated in this way and think in a big way. And then in terms of individuals, like going from the big back to the small, unless we have the values, I think, of non-harm and consideration for others, I think it will be difficult to do, because it starts with the individual in each of these groups and larger organizations that form the institutions, that form the policies. So I think that that's my rethink.